Wyoming Territory, June of 1879. The high plains wind tore across the dry grass as if it meant to lift the world off its hinges, and Seraphina Zeller ran straight into it. Two bundled infants pressed to her chest and a bloodstain spreading down her sleeve. Her boots hit the ground hard, each step cracking against the dirt trail that led out of the mining camp of Bitterstone. Behind her, the shouts were fading, swallowed by the wind and the thick pines. She did not look back. She had already seen enough the iron ring her uncle forced onto her hand. The preacher waiting in the tent, the man twice her age who stank of whiskey and sweat, holding out his hand for her like she was a sack of grain bought and paid for. She clutched her babies tighter. "We are not going back," she whispered to them, breath ragged, voice cracking. "I am your mother, no one else." The twins were only 4 months old. Violet and Vera. Her whole world. The trail curved down into a dry gulch, and her knees nearly buckled. She had not eaten in a day and had barely slept. But she kept moving. She had heard of a rancher's trail that led west toward the foothills. Toward anywhere but here. By dusk, she was staggering. Then came the thunder of hooves. She turned too fast, stumbled, and fell to her knees, shielding the babies. Dust rose around her. A single rider skidded to a stop, boots hitting the ground before the horse had even fully stopped. "Ma'am?" His voice was low, steady, but sounded surprised. "Are you those babies?" The man knelt in front of her. His face came into focus. Young. Maybe 22. Broad shoulders, sun-reddened skin, a strong jaw shadowed with a few days' beard. He had kind, steady eyes. "I am not going back," Seraphina said, her voice shaking. "I do not care who sent you. I would rather die than go back there. I do not know what you are running from," he said, slowly lowering his voice, "but I swear to you I am not chasing you. I was just coming back from town. My shack's a few miles that way." She blinked, unsure if she had heard right. "You live alone?" He nodded. "Name's Merritt Kline. I run cattle when I can. Fix fences for neighbors when I cannot. I got coffee on the stove and a roof that does not leak much. You need help." She hesitated. Then Vera let out a soft cry and Seraphina's arms trembled. She could not go another mile. "I need somewhere safe," she whispered. Merritt nodded once. "Then come on." He helped her onto his horse, lifting the babies into her arms first, careful and gentle. He led the horse by the reins, walking beside her as they cut across the valley. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the land. His shack sat at the edge of a pine grove, a single-room cabin with a stone chimney and a lean-to shed for tools. The inside smelled like burnt coffee, wood smoke, and leather. It was small but clean, the floor swept, a cot in the corner with folded blankets. "I will sleep in the shed," Merritt said, already heading to grab a blanket. "You and the girls take the cot." She looked up at him. "You do not even know me." "I do not need to," he said, shrugging. "You need help. That is enough." Seraphina stood still for a long moment, watching him stack more firewood into the hearth. Her hands ached from holding the babies, but her heart ached more from the way he looked at her, not with judgment or pity or ownership, just quiet concern. She fed the girls, wrapped them in her shawl, and laid them on the cot. She sat on the floor beside them, her back against the wall, knees drawn up. She did not speak. Merritt brought her a cup of warm water. "You hungry?" She shook her head, though her stomach twisted. He sat across from her, back against the opposite wall. "You do not have to tell me anything. But I will say this, whoever you were running from, they are not here." She looked at him, really looked. He had a scar over one brow and calloused hands. There was something steady about him, like the earth itself. "My uncle tried to marry me off," she said finally. Her voice was hoarse. "To a man who paid him for me. I had no say. I had no way out. But I could not let those girls grow up like that. I could not." Merritt nodded, slow and quiet. "I took what I could and ran. I have nowhere to go. No money. Just them." "You got more than that," he said. "You got guts. That counts for something out here." The fire crackled between them, soft and steady. Outside, the wind picked up again, but inside the shack, it was warm. The next morning, Merritt had already swept the porch, fetched water from the creek, and laid out a pot of beans and cornmeal. He held Vera while Seraphina changed Violet's cloth, humming softly to the baby like he had done it 100 times. You do not have to do that, she said, watching him. I know, he said, bouncing Vera gently in his arms. But she likes it. Seraphina's eyes burned. She turned her face away. Over the next few days, she helped where she could, washing dishes, hanging laundry, mending a torn shirt of his with a needle and thread she found in the bottom of her bag. Merritt did not ask questions. He just made space for her. He built a cradle out of scrap wood. It was crooked and rough, but he sanded it smooth and carved little flowers into the ends. He set it by the cot like it had always belonged there. Why would you do this for someone you barely know? She asked him one evening after the girls were asleep. Merritt looked at her, his eyes warm but serious. Because you needed it. And because I like seeing you here. Her breath caught. He stood then, clearing his throat. I will get more firewood. She watched him go. Her heart thudded in her chest, unfamiliar and full. That night, she lay on the cot with the girls beside her, listening to the wind rattle the shutters. She reached out and ran her hand over the edge of the wooden cradle. Her fingers traced one of the carved flowers. She had not felt safe in months. But here, in this tiny shack, with a man who looked at her like she mattered, she felt something new. Hope. And just maybe the beginning of love. The rain came 2 days later, not a drizzle, but a steady, bone-deep soaking that softened the trail ruts and turned the ground behind the shack to sludge. Merritt had just finished tying a canvas sheet over the woodpile when Seraphina stepped onto the porch with Violet in one arm and Vera slung against her hip. Her skirt was damp from brushing against wet grass, and her braid had come loose in the wind. He glanced up. You ought to stay inside. Weather's coming in rough. I was trying to calm them, she said, adjusting Vera's bonnet. They quiet when I walk. Merritt reached up, hand open. Let me carry her. Seraphina hesitated, then passed Violet down. The baby curled into his chest like she knew his heartbeat already. They stood under the porch eaves, watching the sky darken. A hawk wheeled above the pine ridge, then vanished behind the clouds. You said you worked cattle, she said quietly. Do you own them? Not more than 5. Old stock I kept when my pa passed. Most of the herd got sold to pay off his debt. He shifted Violet in his arms. I do odd work now. Fences, hauling. Branding in spring if someone's short a hand. Do you want more than that? He looked at her for a long moment. I'd like to run my own herd again. 50 head, maybe. Enough to trade honest, not beg for work. He glanced down at the baby. Wouldn't mind building something that lasts? The rain thickened, pattering like fingers on the roof. Seraphina stepped closer to keep the baby dry. I used to think I'd live in a house with a porch like this, she said. Only it'd be in Kansas and I'd be married to a man who read books at night and never raised his voice. Her gaze dropped. But that was before. Merritt didn't ask what had happened between then and now. He just shifted sideways so her shoulder brushed his. You still could, he said. I don't want the same things anymore. Her voice was low. Not in the same way. Vera stirred and began to fuss. Seraphina rocked gently, murmuring soft nonsense. Merritt handed Violet back, careful not to let the blanket slip. I should get supper started, she said. I'll get the water, he offered. Creek's fuller, but I'll manage. By the time he returned, she had a meal going, cornmeal thickened into mush, bits of dried apple stirred in. She'd wrapped the girls in a woven shawl and laid them near the hearth. Merritt sat on the floor to eat as if he'd done it this way forever. I could leave, she said suddenly, not looking at him. Once the road dries. I know you didn't ask me to stay. I didn't, he said. But I hoped you would. Seraphina looked up. Her fingers went still over her tin cup. I'm not asking for anything, Merritt added. Not your name, not your story. Just maybe you and the girls stay through the month. Maybe longer if that feels right. She didn't answer for a long time. The fire popped. Outside, the rain softened to a hush. I used to sew for extra coin, she said. Before. I could mend your work shirts if you need. His face warmed. I'd be grateful. She nodded once. Then we'll stay. For now. That night, Seraphina sat by the hearth after the girls fell asleep. Her hands lay folded in her lap, the lamplight casting a soft glow across her cheekbones. Merritt watched her from the cot, blanket pulled to his chest, the cradle between them. I'll ride into town tomorrow, he said quietly. There's a merchant who trades dry goods for pelts. I got a few stashed. Thought I'd trade for sugar. Maybe coffee too. Could you see if they sell needles? She asked. Thread too. I'm running low. He nodded. She gave a small, tired smile. It was the first time he'd seen her smile without caution in it. When the lamplight flickered low, she rose and tucked the cradle's coverlet tighter. Her fingers brushed the carved edge just once before she lay down beside her daughters. Merritt lay awake long after the fire dimmed, listening to the soft rhythm of their breathing. In the morning, he saddled the mare before first light. The road was still slick but passable. Seraphina stood in the doorway with a shawl tight over her shoulders, Vera in one arm, Violet tucked against her chest. Be back before dusk, he said. If the trail holds. She nodded. Her eyes met his, steady. Be careful. He touched the brim of his hat and rode out through the mist. By the time he returned, the wind had cleared the sky. Smoke curled from the chimney. When he walked in, the girls were asleep and Seraphina was darning one of his socks by lamplight. I brought sugar, he said, setting the bag on the table. And coffee. And she stood and crossed the room in 2 steps, reaching for his hand. Her fingers closed around his without hesitation. You didn't have to, she said. I wanted to. He didn't let go. Neither did she. Daylight slipped through the cabin's only window, pale and angled, casting quiet slats of gold across the floorboards. Seraphina stood at the table, sleeves rolled, folding linen into strips. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, separating worn from usable. The scent of boiled coffee lingered from earlier, grounding the room in warmth. Merritt stepped in from the shed, his hat dusted with straw, the morning wind still clinging to his coat. He set the tool in his hand, an iron rasp dulled from use on the shelf without looking away from her. You always work like the sun's chasing you, he said, easing his gloves off. She tied the last cloth square and turned, brushing a damp curl from her brow. Idle hands make me restless. You ever let yourself be still? Not in years, she said. Her voice wasn't bitter, only quiet. It doesn't sit right in me. Stillness. Merritt leaned against the wall, arms loose at his sides. Reckon there's a kind of peace in it if it's chosen. Seraphina looked toward the cradle where the twins were beginning to stir. Maybe, she said. But I don't know what that feels like. He crossed the room and crouched beside the cradle, lifting Vera with practiced ease. The baby blinked up at him, unfazed by the calloused hands or the flannel shirt that smelled faintly of smoke and horsehide. Violet's been sleeping longer between feeds, Seraphina said, watching him. Vera still wakes before dawn. She's got her own rhythm, Merritt said, bouncing her gently. Not a thing wrong with that. Seraphina moved to the stove, ladling hot water into a basin. If I'm to stay longer, I need to do more than mend shirts. You're already doing more than most folks I know, he said without turning. I want to earn it. Merritt stood, settling Vera back down with care. There's a neighbor a few ridges north. Widow named Callahan. Keeps goats and a field of squash. She trades cloth for butter and cheese. Might be she'd want help with sewing. I could ride out, Seraphina said, drying her hands. If you show me the path. I'll take you, he said. Tomorrow, if the weather holds. She nodded, folding the dishcloth with the same methodical hands. That afternoon, she hung herbs to dry from the rafter beam, wild mint she'd gathered behind the creek and yarrow she'd found near the ridge. Merritt watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, the light catching on the fine edge of his profile. You know plants, he said. My mother did, Seraphina replied, not looking away from her work. She taught me enough before she passed. I keep what I remember. You ever use it for healing? If I had to. She hesitated, then added, I brewed willow bark for fever once. Helped a neighbor boy through winter cough. Merritt stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You've done a lot on your own. There wasn't a choice. You have one now. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. That's what scares me. He didn't press. Instead, he moved to the hearth and stoked the coals, drawing the warmth up into the room. Outside, wind brushed through bare cottonwoods, their branches whispering like old bones. Later, as dusk crept in, Seraphina sat on the porch steps with Violet in her lap, humming something half-remembered from childhood. Merritt returned from checking the fence line, his boots muddy, his shoulders damp with sweat from hauling fallen rails. He stopped beside her, quiet. "You sing," he said, "only when I think no one's listening." "I was," he said, "and I liked it." She looked up at him then, something unguarded in her face. "You ever wonder what your life might have been, if things had gone different?" "I used to," he said, lowering himself beside her. "But then I look at what's here now." The silence between them stretched, not heavy, just full. "I was 17 when I married," she said, her voice low. "He died in a logging accident the next spring. The girls came after." Merritt's breath caught slightly, the first time he'd heard the shape of her past. "You raised them alone since?" "I tried. Then my uncle stepped in, said I couldn't manage, said they needed a man's house to grow up in." She looked down at Violet's sleeping face. "But I couldn't trade myself for that. No one should have asked you to." Her eyes met his. "You never ask anything of me, not even why I ran." "I don't need to," he said. "I see the way you fight for them. That tells me all I need." The wind picked up, stirring the edge of her shawl. Merritt reached out, gently tucking it back over her shoulder. His hand brushed her collarbone, then dropped. She didn't move away. Inside, the fire flickered. The cradle creaked gently as Vera stirred. "I'll help you with tomorrow's ride," she said, her voice soft. "If the widow Callahan needs sewing, I'll earn something honest." "You already are," Merritt said. But he didn't stop her. He only stood and held out his hand. She took it, and this time she held on longer. The trail to Widow Callahan's place bent westward through a shallow draw, where the sagebrush grew thick and the air smelled of damp earth. Merritt rode ahead, reins slack in his hand, while Seraphina followed on the mule he'd borrowed from a neighbor, her skirts tucked to keep from catching on the brush. Vera and Violet were swaddled together in a sling across her chest, their heads nestled beneath her chin. They rode in silence for most of the first mile, the only sound the scruff of hooves and the soft hush of wind through the cottonwoods. Then Merritt spoke without turning. "If she seems short with you, don't take it personal. Callahan don't warm easy." "I don't expect warmth," Seraphina said. "Only honesty." He nodded once and didn't say more. The widow's homestead came into view as the sun cleared the ridge behind them. A low-slung sod house, its roof patched with moss and old tar paper, sat beside a goat pen made from scavenged timber. A thin woman in a faded calico dress stepped out, her face lined deep around the mouth, a musket slung across one shoulder. She squinted at the riders until Merritt raised a hand. "You're early," she said as they dismounted. "Figured better than late," Merritt replied. "Brought someone who can sew." Callahan looked Seraphina up and down, eyes lingering on the sleeping babies. "You the one they've been talking about?" she asked. "Ran from Bitterstone?" "I am," Seraphina said, keeping her voice even. The widow grunted. "Well, I need hands more than I need stories. Come inside." Merritt stayed outside, tying the reins. Seraphina followed the woman into the dark cool of the sod house. The air smelled of goat milk and dried onions. A bolt of blue cotton lay stretched across a makeshift table, half cut. "Can you stitch a straight hem and not waste my cloth?" Callahan asked, pulling out a wooden stool. Seraphina set the babies down in a quilt-lined crate by the hearth, then rolled up her sleeves. "You'll see soon enough." By mid-morning, she'd finished a pair of aprons and begun repairing a split in one of the widow's bodices. Callahan watched her work without speaking, but her mouth tightened less with each completed scene. Outside, Merritt helped patch a fence rail the goats had battered through. When Seraphina emerged near noon, her sleeves speckled with lint and the girls still asleep, he was leaning against the post, sleeves rolled, sweat darkening the back of his neck. "She gave me 2 rounds of cheese and a jar of lard," Seraphina said, setting the goods into his saddlebag. "Said I could come again." That's more than I expected, Merritt said. She asked if I'd ever helped with births. He turned to her. Have you? Once. There was a woman in the next county, back when I lived with my mother. Her second child wouldn't turn. The midwife was late. We did what we could. Merritt studied her face. You're steady under pressure. I had to be then. She wiped her hands on her skirt. But I didn't look away. I won't if it happens again. He helped her up onto the mule, careful not to jostle the sling. As they rode back, the sun warmed the high grasses and a pair of meadowlarks chased one another near the creek. You said you used to live with your mother, Merritt said, his tone easy. Where was that? Cloud County, Kansas. She kept a room behind the post office, did mending and midwifery. Folks paid what they could. Sometimes eggs. Sometimes not at all. She teach you to ride? No. My uncle did after she passed. She didn't elaborate. He had horses. And rules. Merritt didn't push. Instead, he pointed toward a low hill ahead. There's a pond down that way. Not deep, but spring-fed. Cold enough to keep butter overnight. She followed his hand with her eyes. You ever fish it? Couple times. It's mostly frogs and mud now. But the water's clean. They reached the cabin by late afternoon. Merritt unloaded the mule while Seraphina settled the girls into their cradle again, their cheeks flushed from the sun. She pulled a damp cloth from the basin and wiped their necks gently. Later, she found him on the south side of the cabin, hammering a board into place where a corner had warped. She stood in the grass, arms crossed, watching. I'd like to grow herbs this spring, she said. Not just wild ones. If you've got seed or know someone who does. I'll ask around, he said, not looking up from his work. There's a man in town who trades for tobacco seed and dried beans. He might have something. I'd pay for it with what I earned from Callahan. He set the hammer down and turned to her. You don't have to buy your place here. I know, she said. But I want to make it better. Not just use what's already here. He stepped closer, brushing a splinter from his palm. You already have. Seraphina looked down at his hand, broad, strong, with a fresh scrape across the thumb. She reached out instinctively, took it in both of hers, and turned it to inspect the wound. It's shallow, she said. But you'll need to keep it clean. He didn't pull away. I trust you, he said, voice low. She looked up and something passed between them, quiet, firm, unmistakable. I know, she said. She didn't let go. And he didn't ask her to. Snow came early that year, sweeping down from the bighorns in thick white silence. It hung in the trees like wool and blanketed the hills so deeply that even the mule balked at the drifts. Inside the cabin, the world narrowed to the glow of the hearth and the rhythm of the day's feeding, mending, tending, surviving. Seraphina kept a kettle warm at all times, and Merritt built a second shelf above the hearth for the jars she brought back from Callahan's, dried berries, rendered tallow, a pair of cracked glass jars filled with pickled roots. One morning, Violet woke with a fever. She's burning, Seraphina said, holding the baby against her chest, her voice tight with worry. She won't take the breast and she shivers even when she's wrapped. Merritt touched her shoulder. You said yarrow can help? I need willow bark and elderflower, she said. But the plants are buried now. He didn't hesitate. Tell me where to look. She wrote it down on the back of a trading slip, describing the slope near the creek where she'd seen the elderflower drying on the branch weeks ago, the bend in the trail where the willow grew low and pale. He set out while the sun was still struggling through the clouds, wrapped in his old oilskin and carrying a canvas sack. He returned near dusk, his boots soaked, the sack heavy with snow-damp bark and stiff stems. I found what you listed, he said, setting the sack beside the stove. It took some digging, but it was there. She didn't speak, just reached for the herbs and began working, crushing them into a poultice with warm water and wrapping it in cloth. Merritt held Violet steady while Seraphina pressed the bundle gently to the child's chest, then coaxed a thin tea between her lips. They sat up that night in shifts. Merritt took the first, dozing upright with the baby curled against his shoulder while Seraphina slept in the cot with Vera, her arm curled protectively around the smaller girl. When she woke, Merritt was still upright, bleary-eyed and quiet. She's breathing easier, he said. Fever's lower. Seraphina touched Violet's forehead, her fingers trembling from relief. You stayed up the whole time? I couldn't sleep, he said. Not while she burned like that. The next morning, when Violet's eyes opened and she reached for the edge of her blanket, Seraphina wept. Not loudly. Just a long exhale, her face buried in the crook of Merritt's neck as he held her, one hand cradling the back of her head like it was something sacred. Later that week, while Vera napped and Violet gummed a strip of dried apple, Seraphina laid out strips of flannel on the table. I want to make them winter gowns, she said. They'll outgrow what they've got by January, and I can't keep borrowing from Callahan's scraps. I can ride to town with you, Merritt offered. You pick what you want. I'll trade pelts for the rest. She looked up from the cloth. I'd rather not take what I can't repay. I'm not offering charity, he said. I'm offering partnership. She hesitated. What kind of partnership? Merritt stepped closer, the firelight catching in his eyes. One where you don't have to ask to belong here. One where you and the girls don't have to keep planning to leave. Seraphina's hands stilled on the fabric. You're asking me to stay. As your wife. I'm not asking anything yet, he said. I'm telling you I want a life with you. One where we build things together, cradles, fences, maybe a barn if I stop patching the roof long enough. She laughed softly, a sound that felt like it had been waiting in her chest for too long. I've never had a man ask for less than everything all at once. I'm not most men, Merritt said. No, she whispered. You're not. She stepped into him and he held her like he'd been holding his breath since the day she arrived. They married before the thaw, with Widow Callahan as witness. She brought a loaf of bread and a jar of goat milk and stood silent while Merritt and Seraphina exchanged vows in front of the hearth. There was no preacher, just a quiet promise between two people who already knew what it meant to carry and to be carried. That night, after the girls were asleep in their shared cradle and the fire had burned low, Seraphina stood barefoot on the worn floorboards, Merritt's coat draped over her shoulders. I never thought I'd feel safe again, she said. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. It's not safety if you're trapped. This is yours as much as it is mine. She turned, resting her hand on his chest. Then let's make it better. Together. And they did. As the months passed, the cabin grew into something more than shelter. Merritt built shutters for the windows. Seraphina planted thyme and chamomile in raised boxes by the porch. The twins learned to crawl, then to walk, their laughter echoing over the ridge like spring birdsong. Neighbors came more often, asking for help with mending or sick animals, and Seraphina welcomed them with firm hands and a calm voice. Merritt taught Violet to hold a hammer before she turned 3. Vera learned to whistle before she spoke a full sentence. They sat side by side at the table each evening, Merritt's hand brushing Seraphina's, the girls nestled between them, bowls steaming. It wasn't grand or easy or loud, but it was full. It was theirs, and the land, with its wind and frost and quiet, bore witness to the life they built. One stitch, one fence post, one quiet evening at a time. They never left. They never needed to.